I have been asked to present what Karol Wojtyła means by experience, that most deceitful and most obscure of terms, as Whitehead and Gadamer described it. To grasp how Wojtyła understands this concept, we need to see the place it has in the answer to the main question proposed by person and act. Allow me then to revisit this question by recalling the remarkable insight we find in Alcibiades 1. The unknown author of this work has Socrates warned his friend Alcibiades that before pursuing a political career in Athens, he needs to take care of his soul. The best way to begin to attend to our souls, says Socrates, is to heed the Delphic maxim inscribed in Apollo's temple. Know yourself, and ask, how can we get the clearest knowledge of our soul? With a stroke of genius, Socrates proposes to replace the pronoun yourself with a term that designates the organ of vision, I. He then suggests that the best way to see one's own I is to look at it as it is reflected in the eye of a friend who is looking at us. Socrates then argues that the most profound way to know our soul is to look at its reflection in the gaze of a friend, that is, in the part of his soul that most, quote, resembles the divine. Bearing this insight in mind, I would like to suggest that Wojtyła's work is a philosophical attempt to respond anew to the Socratic question. Like Socrates, Wojtyła doesn't address the question from an abstract point of view, as if the pursuit to know man's soul could be carried out from nowhere, but from Christ's gaze upon man that reveals to him that he is a person endowed by God with an infinite value and not just an individual. Thus, resting on this tacit theological presupposition, in person and act, the Socratic question takes this form. In which way does action reveal the person? Or, in other terms, how are we to approach the relationship between person and act so that the mystery of the person may be better seen? To understand the question well, it is important to realize that, as Rocco Buttiglione cogently clarifies, person and act does not seek to, quote, demonstrate that man is a person, nor to classify human acts from the point of view of their personalistic value, end quote. Rather, as Michael Gabser puts it, person and act is a philosophical attempt to show how human action reveals man to himself. To realize how can we know the human person, how man and the act that reveals him as a person belong together, Wojtyła claims that there is only one path to tread, the experience of man. This should not surprise us. At the Lublin lectures, Wojtyła already claimed that an integrally considered experience is and must be the constant starting point for all human knowledge, both pre-scientific and scientific. In Person and Act, he brings this principle to bear on the question at hand and shows its epistemological and methodological fruitfulness for approaching the mystery of the human person. Experience, then, is the indispensable and permanent beginning for whomever wishes to know who man is. From his early study on faith according to St. John and the various theatrical plays he wrote, through the Lublin lectures and his habilitation thesis on Scheller, to his catechesis on human love and encyclical letters, Wojtyła remained faithful to the methodological primacy of experience. Yet, since his area of concern was ethics and not epistemology or fundamental theology, he never wrote a systematic account on experience. The most thorough essay on this topic is the short introduction to Person and Act. Given the objective limitations at hand, my remarks seek to explore three questions that can help us have a better sense of what Wojtyła means by the experience of man. I would like to clarify at the outset that I will not speak of experience as a general category that is in its capacity to refer to any possible given. I will focus instead on the experience we have of ourselves as human beings. The three questions are, why does Wojtyła use the term experience? Second, what kind of knowledge does the experience of man grant? And third, what is the method that the experience of man is called to follow? So the first question is, why does Wojtyła contend that experience occupies a central place in any account of the metaphysical sense of the human person that wishes to be adequate? Wojtyła was fully aware that rationalists of various kinds, particularly Descartes and Kant, tend to locate the truth of the knowledge that derives from experience in the knowing subject. In fact, the very opening line of Person and Act hints at this subjectivistic reduction when it states, "This study arises from the need for objectivization in the area of the great cognitive process that may be defined as the experience of man." Wojtyła was equally alert to the partiality of the naturalist reduction of ethics, which holds that the judgments on the good are empirical and that the truth of these judgments can be assessed only through experience, since it alone and not intellectual intuition grants access to the object through empirical data. His theological studies also made him conscious of the inadequacy of this term when it was used either to advocate for the unmediated emotive feeling signaling the presence of the divine in the believer, or to uphold that one's historical experience is the fitting measure of Christian revelation and of human nature to cure. Why then does Wojtyła turn to experience to carry out what he thought was the fundamental task of our times, namely the recapitulation of the inviolable mystery of the human person? The long and troubled history of the term experience should not make us think that it would be better to dispense with it altogether. The First Council of Nicaea used the Greek term ousia to uphold the Son's equal divinity with the Father, even if its proper meaning took a long time to be understood. The complex history of experience simply requires careful thought. Furthermore, it is shallow to claim that an erroneous interpretation of experience is bereft of any true insight or genuine question. Just as empiricists rightly call to mind the concrete singularity of finite beings, rationalist accounts insist on the indispensable role of the spirit in the constitution of being. An adequate concept of experience needs to gather within itself all its elements in an organic whole. In the key 1975 essay, Subjectivity and the Irreducible in Man, Wojtyła acknowledges that the enduring importance of Aristotelian metaphysics. Yet he also claims that Aristotle's cosmological anthropology, and I quote, contains, at least in the foreground, a conviction of the reducibility of man to the world, end quote. This philosophical position, adopted by Boethius' definition of person and slightly modified by Aquinas, perceives man as an, he says, object of the world. Aristotelian metaphysics, argues Wojtyła, accounts for man's being in terms of agere and pati, matter and form, act and potency. Within this metaphysical framework, person cannot but mean the individual that possesses himself, is incommunicable to another, and can act of himself. For Wojtyła, however, man is not only a suppositum, a subjectum, a subject of a rational nature. Man is also someone who experiences himself as a subject, that is, as an I, irreducible to the world. What is at stake, Wojtyła writes, is not only a metaphysical objectivization of man as the acting subject, that is, the agent of his acts, but also a presentation of the person as the subject experiencing his acts, his experiences, and, in all this, his subjectivity, end quote. Wojtyła's concept of person calls for a different kind of metaphysics, that is, one that is able to articulate man's peculiar subjectivity as human experience attests to it, that is, in its objective and subjective dimensions. It is precisely here that we discover why experience has such an indispensable role. Experience is the way we become aware of the inseparable unity of our being and our selfhood, of our individuality and our personal singularity. Experience lets us see both our own selfhood and our own nature. The experience of man, as Person and Act defines it, is the direct cognitive contact of man with himself as object and subject. It is experience that allows us to see, quote, the human act and its relation to the person, in the sense that the concrete cognitive act directly grasps this act, that is, grasps conscious action in its relation to the man person, end quote. The human experience is the direct contact with oneself as both object and subject, as an individual member of mankind and as someone. The experience of being an individual member of mankind also entails that the experiencing subject discovers the other as another I, and this realization enriches further the experience each one has of oneself. As offering a direct cognitive contact with oneself, experience can never be left behind in a reflection on the mystery of the human person. Otherwise, the self will fall out from view, and it will be difficult to articulate an adequate anthropology, that is one that, among other things, can show how the meaning of existence is realized by the human being. Besides what I just said, the etymological account of experience used by Wojtyła shows further the distinct phenomenological quality of this concept. Rather than following the Greek and Latin roots from which the English term experience derives, Wojtyła has in mind its Polish origin. In an unpublished or yet to be published essay titled Ethics, Wojtyła writes that the word experience originates from the verb I experience, can't pronounce the Polish, so yeah. That is, I am a direct witness, an eyewitness. End quote. To experience is to see something take place. It is to be a direct witness of what lets itself be seen, if one is paying attention. According to the other Polish derivative used by Wojtyła, unpronounceable, not to the Poles, right? To most of humankind is unpronounceable. Experience also means to live through or life live through, what in German is Erlebnis. If the first sense calls attention to the object of experience, the second sense regards the subjective dimension of experience, that is, the experiencing subject. Wojtyła's concept of experience then regards the self-giving of the intelligible object in the cognitive act. In our case, human experience is the self-giving of the concrete human person as subject in the act that reveals him, and by living through it, the person becomes himself. In light of this, then, I would like to suggest that the subjective and objective genitive of experience of man keeps these two meanings together. Let us now raise the second question. What does Wojtyła mean by direct cognitive contact? Is direct cognitive contact Wojtyła's appropriation of the modern consent to articulate the presuppositionless beginning that a science requires if it wishes to express what is true? As you can see, the second question explores the epistemological dimension of experience. The last question will deal with its methodological dimension. So, as an epistemological category, experience depends on how we understand being and truth, just as being and truth depend on how we conceive experience. I already hinted in the first question at the relationship between the human being or being and experience. To see what kind of knowledge Wojtyła's experience of man grants, let us now ponder the peculiar relationship between truth and experience. Although it is not possible here to offer the required nuances, it is still fair to say that the Platonic, Aristotelian, and Thomistic traditions locate truth, the movement from physis to logos, in the judgment. Through judgments, we can know and speak what is. The truthfulness of the judgment is measured by the adequation between reason and the being that is known. Within this sense of truth, experience, this tradition, is a technical mastery and practical wisdom gained from living, often through risking and probing, that science needs since it contributes evidence to understanding. Experience, then, is a knowledge that lies between sense knowledge and science. So science here means philosophy. Modernity, instead, places truth not so much in the judgment, but in the ego. Keeping in mind that the ego doesn't have a univocal meaning identical in all modern authors, it still is correct to say that modern authors do not see the ego as a being, among others, that also possesses consciousness and the capacity to know beings, or as a transparency to being, or as reflectiveness of being. The ego, instead, is pure consciousness of the other, and at the same time of oneself as oneself. The Cartesian cogito, preceded by Occam's attempt to ground certainty in the self's understanding, and retrieved by Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, is where the direct ontological unity of subject and object that escaped pre-modern authors takes place. The cogito, then, is not the traditional subjectum of being, but the real subject, without which there is no truth. The modern relocation of truth in the ego brings about the transformation of experience from a way of knowing, so the second level between sense knowledge and science, to the very form of knowledge. Much more will need to be said to justify this claim. Here, I think suffices to recall that as it starts to be argued by Occam, experience is now seen as the way to know with certainty what alone exists, that is, the individual beings which are both the objects outside of the mind and the internal objects of the mind. If the primacy of the individual entails considering sense perception as the prime analogate for experience, once consciousness is seen as a faculty for internal perception, then experience, ordered and informed by scientific experiment, becomes the mode of knowledge par excellence. It is not by chance that both John Locke's empiricism and Descartes' rationalism share with Occam the enormous significance of intuition, that is, the immediate sensible or intellectual perception granted through experience to acquire certain knowledge. If for Locke both experience of internal operations and external objects and conscience are intuitive or immediate knowledge, for Descartes, internal and external perception yields certain knowledge. Experience in Husserl's and Seller's phenomenology also gives this primacy to direct intuition in that it regards, as Michael Wallstein states, I quote, the immediate and presuppositionless givenness of essences apart from the whole order of real existence. Given this peculiar phenomenological approach and his acceptance of the modern pursuit of a concept of human subjectivity that can responsibly ground the certainty that truth requires, Wojtyła's claim that the experience is the cognitive immediacy of what gives itself to be seen can make us think that his account of truth and experience simply reflect their modern transformation. Although Wojtyła's perception of truth, not fully developed in Person and Act, includes elements of the Aristotelian and Thomistic understanding of truth, his account of the subject is not a pre-modern subjectum. Man, as Wojtyła never tires of repeating, is not just an individual rational being. Man is a person endowed with the task of becoming himself. Experience's direct contact, then, doesn't just yield a knowledge that precedes science, scientific knowledge. At the same time, his sense of subject is not the modern ego either. The subject for him is not the ultimate responsible for what is known, but the person as him whose being is revealed through his action. I would like to suggest, therefore, that Wojtyła's perception of truth is closer to the Greek meaning of unhiddenness or revelation, although this aletheic sense is not that of Heidegger. Since Wojtyła sees the person as a mystery that can neither be abstracted from his proper context nor broken into fragments, experience is not the very form of knowledge as moderns thought. Neither is the knowledge that the experience of man yields the fruit of an experiment, nor is the direct cognitive access that experience grants reducible to sense perception. Several reasons can be mentioned to show that cognitive directness of contact cannot be taken as expressive of a presuppositionless science in which there is no ontological distance between the subject and the object, because truth has been relocated to the transcendental ego. Wojtyła always upheld, first, the created character of finite beings, and later on of creation and being as gift. Second, the inseparability of the experience of oneself from that of others, from the community. And third, and although he didn't fully elaborate it, the novel revelatory character of being whereby the human person gives himself to be known through his own acts. There is one additional reason we need to recall. Wojtyła's concept of experience of man is not patterned after the intentionality proper of the consciousness of objects, because as Josef Seifert rightly suggests, for Wojtyła, we have an experiential contact with ourselves prior to turning the ego into and its acts into objects about which we know or think. I thus would like to argue that Wojtyła's account of the direct cognitive contact of the experience of man is very close to Augustine's explanation of the Delphic inscription, "Know yourself." For Augustine, every man possesses a tacit knowledge of himself, se gnose, that grounds and enables the explicit knowledge of himself, se cogitare. We always know ourselves, although we rarely think who we are. In this sense, the knowledge that the experience of man grants is the coming to terms with the constant, albeit unthought, presence of oneself to oneself, and the becoming aware of oneself as a self, not only as an individual, through our own acts. Experience of man, as the keeping together of person and the revealing act, helps the person to become aware of his own mystery in a non-conceptual fashion through the self-revelatory act in which he becomes himself, or not. How does Wojtyła's revelatory experience avoid the modern swinging back and forth from the Lockean nod to the Aristotelian defense of the individual, to the transcendental claim of the presuppositionless character of subjectivity, without reducing experience to its pre-modern sense of technical mastery or practical wisdom? In other words, how is the revelatory character of the experience of man to be understood? The revelatory nature of experience is best seen when we realize that for Wojtyła, human experience is an integral, dynamic, and ultimately simple and unified vision of the human person, in which he becomes aware of himself as a subject entrusted to himself and others, as a subject that has the task of becoming himself, as we just heard, by affirming what is truly good. Wojtyła argues that every person knows from his own internal experience that human experience is a totality whose elements cannot be separated. Although he doesn't elaborate the elements that form part of an integral experience in a systematic way, it is possible to mention some of the main ones that emerge in his writings. The ones I know, at least. If we first consider human experience as such, Wojtyła claims that man never experiences anything outside of himself without in some way experiencing himself in this experience. For him, the outer experience of other human beings standing over me and of myself as other, and the inner experience of my own subjectivity are simultaneous. Inwardness and outwardness, just as the psyche, the body, and the self belong together in every human experience, as does the existence of the single person and his participation in the community in which he lives. Human experience comprises then the self, with its interiority and exteriority, the self's being and its consciousness, and the others with whom one lives. If we consider the Lublin lectures, we discover the same concern to uphold an integral concept of experience. Similarly to the empiricist account, Wojtyła's concept of experience also offers some knowledge derived from the senses. Yet, differently from it also has some understanding of the self and of the universality proper to epistemic knowledge. Like the rationalist account, experience requires understanding. But differently from it, understanding is not simply derived from the ego. Rather, It rests on the asymmetrical relation between the world and man. Studying the ethical works of Scheler and Kant, Wojtyła contends that both of them separate one aspect from the totality of experience and universalize this aspect. Whereas Scheler affirms value without norms, Kant upholds duty without a proper understanding of values. Wojtyła instead contends that human experience carries them together. And I quote, "The totality of ethical lived experience contains not only value as objective content, but also the normative moment in which values are ordered and posited as a task to be realized." End quote. Experience, besides being an integral whole, is also dynamic. It is dynamic not only because it happens and develops in time, but also because the content to be experienced is the relation of person and act, and the act is, as he says, is given as a moment of the vision of the person. As an individual and as a self, the human person knows from experience to be always in a relative becoming, to be in fieri. The person is called to adhere to the true good, which he also knows from experience, and thus becomes himself. A difficult issue, more difficult perhaps, needs to be mentioned here. How does one know what belongs with experience? How does one avoid neglecting an element or arbitrarily imposing one that doesn't belong to it? Unfortunately, as far as I know, Wojtyła did not discuss the criteria for assessing when an experience is true, that is, when it grants an adequate vision of all of man, and when it is instead erroneous. Yet I think it is reasonable to claim that for him, experience's total or integral character can be recognized by man because the experience of man possesses its own peculiar evidence. Since experience has an epistemological primacy, it endows man with the capacity to recognize what forms part of it. One thus needs to be a careful, patient, and humble listener of human experience. Keeping in mind his personalist phenomenology, or perhaps with a better adjective, transphenomenal metaphysics, Wojtyła claims that all the elements that belong with experience are given to man. In other terms, he claims that while being part of his own existence, these elements give themselves to be known by man, who is called to recognize them in freedom and to avoid the speculative temptation to fragment human experience. More simply put, in every experience we have the whole of man, and all of the person is at stake. In this way, Wojtyła exhibits a confidence both in human nature and in the person's capacity to recognize and realize what he is given in experience. If one approaches human experience from a preconceived anthropology, as he thinks Kant and Scheler do, one will fragment human experience, and the very mystery of the human person will remain opaque to him. This remark on the right approach to experience brings us to the third and final question, with a shorter answer. What is the epistemological method that an adequate concept of experience invites us to follow? Exploring the methodological character of experience will also help us to see its peculiar unitary character. The vision of the person through the act, says Wojtyła, is accomplished on the basis of the experience of man. The vision of man, he claims, passes through three stages: induction, reduction, and integration. Although there is a certain chronological order, they form a simple totality that introduces us to a genuine sense of the mystery of the human person. By induction, the plurality of facts belonging to the experience that man has of himself is gathered into a semantic unity, a fundamental sameness which, however, is not equivalent to cancelling the experiential wealth and diversity of the experience of man. Induction, therefore, is neither the abstractive grasp of form, which leaves the individual instantiations of the essence behind, nor the description of facts, which presupposes the immediate vision of the facts. As Rodrigo López noted, Wojtyła follows Aristotle's account of induction as that which grants a vision of the universal in the singular. Similarly to how different beautiful things are preserved in the perception of beauty, so the semantic unity is the experiential grasp of several facts, relation of the person to given human acts, into a unified meaning. Induction rescues us from the dispersion of the multiplicity of internal and external facts, and by yielding a certain sameness, brings us to the second stage, the reduction, or as Wojtyła explains, the leading back of that sameness to its proper reasons. Reduction is, as he says, the attempt to explain, clarify, and interpret the semantic unity of the experience of man. Both induction and reduction are immanent to the experience of man, which also means that reduction is not simply abstraction, although reduction or interpretation is also transcendent to experience. The goal of reduction, then, is to ensure that, I quote, the image grasps all the reasons explaining the object and grasps them correctly, preserving the proper proportions between them. The difficulty of this interpretation, of course, lies in the fact that the twofold incommensurability that consists, on the one hand, of man as a member of the species and man as an unrepeatable self, and on the other hand, of man and other men. Once the unity of induction and reduction has been reached, then it is possible to see that the experience of man, in fact, appears always through consciousness and reveals to man that he is the efficacious author of his own acts. The experience of man witnesses that the person, as source of his own acts, transcends his own acts in the very free determination of himself. Yet this transcendence is not the ultimate stage of the vision of man. A third stage, called integration, is needed. Transcendence needs to be integrated with the psychosomatic dimension of each human person and with his belonging to the larger community. When the body and the psyche of the person are integrated in the human action, the person can be perceived in his unity. These three stages, induction, reduction, integration, carried out throughout Wojtyła's key work, give us an approach to the mystery of the human person that flows out from and remains within the experience that man has of himself, so that he can be more aware of who he is and live authentically. So let me conclude. During the years he wrote Person and Act, Wojtyła also attended the Second Vatican Council. Wojtyła and this work of his were greatly influenced by it. The future pontiff, in fact, saw Person and Act as a contribution to the Church's task laid out by F.S.C.B to safeguard the transcendent character of the human person. Wojtyła, in a similar way to Socrates' attempt to help his friend Alcibiades to get the clearest knowledge of our soul, was always in pursuit of the retrieval and deepening of the concrete ontological mystery of the human person. He wrote Person and Act with the conviction that the experience of man enables the person to come to cognitive contact with the mystery of his own person. Wojtyła hoped that if one pays close attention to the total, dynamic, and unified character of man's experience, it will be a little bit more difficult for the human person to take himself for granted. An authentically lived experience of man enables the human person to realize his dignity and opens him up to the encounter with that ultimate incarnate true good in whom the human person finds his overabundant and gratuitous fulfillment. Thank you.